I didn't scream when the excavator claw punched through the glass wall of my lake house, didn't run, didn't beg, just stood there in the gravel driveway with cold mud seeping into my bare feet, watching 20 years of my life shatter in real time while the HOA president leaned against her white SUV, smiling like she was watching a fireworks show she'd paid for. The sound wasn't one big crash like you'd expect but a series of slow, deliberate crunches, glass popping, wood snapping, steel groaning, each hit space just long enough for it to register, for it to hurt. And what made it worse was how calm the morning had been before that. The lake flat as glass, fog lifting in thin ribbons, the smell of pine and water and diesel mixing into something I still can't forget, and all of it over a $280 fine, not unpaid taxes, not some criminal investigation, just a typed notice taped to my door 3 weeks earlier accusing me of non-compliant exterior modifications, which was HOA language for "we don't like you." And as the excavator arm swung back again, I caught sight of the dining room window collapsing inward, the one my wife and I had stood in front of every Sunday morning with coffee, arguing about nothing, laughing about everything, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that I'd never moved the scratch on the floor from when she dropped the cast iron pan years ago because I liked knowing it was there. Proof that life had actually happened inside those walls. Proof that this wasn't just a house, and yet here it was being reduced to rubble while a woman I'd spoken to exactly twice in my life filmed it on her phone, narrating quietly to herself, probably already imagining the Facebook comments, probably already practicing the smile she'd use when she told the board how decisive leadership sometimes required hard choices. And I wish I could say I confronted her, that I yelled or threw something or did anything dramatic, but the truth is I was frozen, not from fear, but from the strange, hollow disbelief that comes when something so irrational happens that your brain refuses to accept it as real, like watching a dream turn violent without warning. And the only thing that snapped me out of it was the foreman, a tired-looking man with a clipboard who didn't meet my eyes when he said, "Sir, we're authorized to proceed," as if authorization could turn vandalism into justice. And I asked him who authorized it even though I already knew the answer, and he nodded toward her without looking, and that's when she finally pushed off the SUV and walked closer, heels crunching on gravel, sunglasses still on even though the sun hadn't fully burned through the fog. And she said my name the way people do when they want to sound sympathetic without actually feeling it, slow and soft, like she was comforting a child who'd dropped an ice cream cone, and she told me this didn't have to happen, that I'd been given ample opportunity to comply, that rules were rules, and communities only functioned when everyone followed them, and I remember staring at her mouth as she spoke because it was still smiling, not wide, not obvious, just enough to show satisfaction, just enough to let me know this wasn't about compliance or paint colors or property values. This was about power, about proving that she could do this to me and I couldn't stop her. And somewhere behind her the excavator arm came down again, tearing through the roofline and a section of wall collapsed inward, exposing the bedroom where my wife slept during her last months, the room where I'd installed those ridiculous blackout curtains because the sunrise bothered her eyes after the chemo, and something inside me finally cracked, not loudly, not violently, but quietly, like a pressure seal giving way. And I understood in that moment that this wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore, this was a line being crossed, one that couldn't be uncrossed, and I also understood something else. Something she didn't, something no one on that board knew yet, because if they had, they never would have touched that excavator, never would have signed those papers, never would have smiled that morning, because while they thought they were enforcing authority over one stubborn homeowner who didn't respect the rules, they were actually standing on land they didn't own, issuing orders they didn't have the legal right to give, and destroying a structure they had no jurisdiction over at all. And I didn't realize it yet, not fully, but as I stood there watching the last intact wall of my home tilt and collapse into a cloud of dust, I was also watching the beginning of something else, something much bigger than a fine or a house or an HOA, because that morning didn't just take something from me, it handed me proof, and all I had to do now was figure out exactly what they'd missed, who had failed to read what, and how deep their mistake really went. The demolition crew was gone by noon, leaving behind a flattened skeleton of what used to be my home, exposed beams jutting out at odd angles like broken ribs, insulation soaked through with lake water and coolant, the air thick with dust that refused to settle. And what struck me most wasn't the destruction itself but how quickly everyone lost interest once it was done. The HOA president drove off without another word. The neighbors who'd gathered with phones and folding chairs drifted back to their houses, already bored, already satisfied, as if the story had ended exactly the way it was supposed to, villain punished, order restored, and I stood there alone long after the last engine noise faded, trying to process how something this permanent could be justified by a piece of paper taped to my door. And that's when the second realization hit me, quieter than the first but sharper, more dangerous. Nobody had tried very hard to stop this, not the county, not the city, not even the contractor. Everyone had simply accepted that the authority existed, that the permission was valid, that the signature at the bottom of the order meant something real, and if everyone was this willing to move on faith, then whatever mistake had been made wasn't small, it was structural, buried somewhere deep enough that no one had questioned it in years, and I didn't call a lawyer that afternoon, didn't call the police, didn't even call my insurance because every instinct I had told me that doing so would force this into a narrow lane where someone else would control the pace, and pace mattered now. What I did instead was sit on the tailgate of my truck and start replaying everything from the beginning. The first notice taped slightly crooked to my door, the way the parcel number looked almost right but not quite, the inspection photos taken from odd angles that never quite showed the shoreline marker, the red stakes driven into the ground without survey flags, the way every question I asked had been answered quickly but vaguely, like they were reciting from a script designed to sound official without actually explaining anything, and the more I thought about it the more a pattern emerged, not of competence but of assumption. Everyone involved assumed someone else had checked the details, assumed someone else had verified the authority, assumed the paperwork matched the land, and assumptions like that only survive in systems that haven't been challenged in a long time, systems where the same people deal with the same properties year after year and stop looking too closely at the fine print. So that evening I went home, not to the house that no longer existed but to my office, and pulled out the original closing documents from when I'd bought the property, documents I hadn't looked at in years because no one ever does once the keys are in hand, and I spread them across the desk slowly, deliberately reading every line the way you do when you're not looking for reassurance but for contradiction. And that's when I noticed it again, the thing that had bothered me from the start. The legal description of the land didn't match the way the HOA described it, not in a dramatic way, not with some glaring error, but in the quiet language of easements, subparcels, and shoreline adjustments, references to a rezoning action from decades earlier that had split a single lakeside tract into multiple administrative zones, and one of those zones, mine, had been reassigned jurisdictional oversight at the county level, not the neighborhood level, a change that was perfectly legal, properly recorded, and almost certainly forgotten because it didn't affect most people, until someone tried to enforce authority that no longer applied, and I felt that pressure again, that strange mix of anger and clarity, because this wasn't about whether they were wrong, it was about how wrong, and how many times that wrongness had been repeated without anyone noticing. So the next morning I drove to the county records office, not angry, not loud, just another person pulling a number and waiting their turn. And when I finally sat down with the clerk, a tired woman with glasses sliding down her nose, I didn't accuse anyone of anything, I just asked a simple question, one that sounded boring enough to be harmless. Can you confirm which authority has enforcement jurisdiction over parcel number? And I gave her the number exactly as it appeared on the demolition order, and I watched her type it in, watched her frown slightly, watched her scroll back up and re-enter it more slowly, and then I watched her turn the screen toward me without a word, because on her system, that parcel didn't exist the way the HOA thought it did. It redirected, quietly, to a master shoreline entry that had been deprecated years earlier, an entry that still existed for historical reference but carried no enforcement permissions. And I asked her what that meant, keeping my voice neutral, and she hesitated before saying, "It means someone's been using an old reference." And I asked how long, and she couldn't tell me because the system didn't track that kind of misuse unless someone complained. And that was the moment I understood the scale of it, because if my house had been targeted under an outdated jurisdiction, then so had every other lakeside property that fell under the same reference point, dozens of them, maybe more. And none of those owners had questioned it because most enforcement actions were small, fines, warnings, compliance letters, nothing dramatic enough to force a deeper look, until mine, until demolition, until something irreversible had happened. And when I left the office that day I didn't feel victorious or relieved, I felt unsettled because the truth was now bigger than my loss, and once you touch something like that, you don't get to put it back. And over the next few days I made copies, not just of my documents but of public records, zoning maps, rezoning minutes, archived notices, anything that showed the transition from one authority to another, and I didn't send them all at once. I sent them selectively, quietly, starting with a formal inquiry to the county's Land Use Compliance Division, framed not as a complaint but as a request for clarification, then a follow-up to environmental oversight regarding shoreline enforcement boundaries, and then, carefully, a notice to the contractor's licensing board asking whether demolition carried out under invalid authority exposed them to liability, because pressure doesn't have to be loud to be effective, it just has to be precise. And I could feel the shift before anyone said anything to me. Emails that had once been answered in hours started taking days, automatic replies replaced names, calls were returned by assistants instead of decision makers. And then, one afternoon, I received a message that wasn't meant to reassure me at all. It was meant to slow me down, a polite but firm request to pause further inquiries while the matter was reviewed internally, which was confirmation enough that I wasn't wrong, because no one asks you to stop asking questions when everything is in order. And that same evening, as I drove past the lake, I noticed something else that hadn't been there before: orange survey flags lining the shoreline, not just near my property but stretching down past several neighboring lots, placed neatly, professionally, the kind of thing you don't do unless someone higher up has asked for measurements. And I didn't smile, didn't feel satisfaction, because I knew what came next wouldn't be quick or clean. Once a system realizes it's been operating on a bad assumption, it doesn't fix itself quietly. It locks down, it audits, it looks for a way to contain the damage, and containment usually means finding someone to blame. And the people who had smiled while my house came down were suddenly very invested in making sure that blame didn't land on them. The pushback didn't arrive as anger or denial, it arrived as silence first, the kind that stretches just long enough to make you doubt yourself. Emails marked received, but never answered, phone calls routed through generic voicemail trees that promise callbacks no one intended to make. And for a few days I wondered if they were hoping I'd get tired, if the system's oldest trick, delay, might still work here, because most people can't afford to wait indefinitely when their home is already gone. But then the silence broke in small, carefully calibrated ways: a certified letter requesting that I cease unauthorized dissemination of internal documents, even though every page I'd shared was public record, a warning that further action might complicate resolution, which was bureaucratic language for "you're making people nervous." And then one morning, I found a notice posted at the edge of my property declaring the site unsafe and restricted pending further review, bright red tape strung across ground that no longer had anything to protect. And that's when I understood the new phase had begun, because when authority starts losing confidence, it doesn't retreat, it tightens, it tries to reassert control through optics, through visible markers that say we're still in charge here, even if no one can quite explain why. And the neighbors noticed it too. I could tell by the way they slowed their cars as they passed, by the way conversations stopped when I walked into the small lakeside market, by the way the HOA president, who had once been everywhere, suddenly avoided public spaces altogether, delegating appearances to people who spoke carefully and said nothing of substance. And in the middle of all this, I received a call from someone who introduced himself as a regional compliance coordinator, a title vague enough to be impressive without committing to anything. And he spoke the way people do when they want to sound reasonable while quietly establishing dominance, thanking me for my patience, acknowledging my loss, assuring me that these matters were rarely straightforward, and then almost casually suggesting that continuing to involve multiple departments might slow down the process for everyone, including me. And I asked him calmly what process he was referring to, because as far as I could tell, my house had already been destroyed without any process at all. And there was a pause on the line then, just a fraction of a second too long before he shifted tone and said he understood my frustration, but that escalation wasn't always productive. And I let him talk, because people reveal more when they think they're guiding you somewhere. And what he revealed, without meaning to, was that the review wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about exposure, about how far back the error went, how many actions were tied to it, and whether it could be reframed as a misunderstanding rather than a systemic failure. And that told me everything I needed to know, because misunderstandings get settled quietly, failures get audited publicly. So I thanked him for the call and told him I'd be happy to consolidate my inquiries once I had a clear written statement outlining jurisdictional authority over my parcel, which was a polite way of saying I wasn't going anywhere. And the next move came not from the county or the HOA, but from someone closer, a neighbor I barely knew, knocking on my door late one afternoon, his voice low, his eyes darting toward the road as he told me I was making things harder than they needed to be, that people were worried, that property values were already being discussed. And when I asked him who exactly was worried, he didn't answer directly, just said that sometimes it was better to accept a settlement and move on. And that word, settlement, landed heavily, because no one settles something they're confident about. And I realized then that they were testing a different tactic, not authority but pressure, social pressure, the unspoken threat of isolation in a place where everyone knows everyone. And it would have worked on most people. It almost worked on me, because there's a particular loneliness that comes with being the person who disrupts the comfortable lie everyone else has been living with. But what they couldn't see, what no one but me fully understood yet, was that the disruption was already out of their control, because while they were trying to contain the fallout locally, the paperwork I'd triggered was moving through systems that didn't care about neighborhood harmony or property values, systems that operated on checklists and compliance metrics. And once those gears start turning, they don't stop just because things get awkward. And proof of that arrived on a gray Tuesday morning when a pair of unmarked vehicles parked along The shoreline and 2 surveyors stepped out, not contractors, not HOA representatives, but county-certified professionals carrying tablets and measurement equipment. And they didn't talk to anyone, didn't ask permission, they simply started working, marking points, cross-referencing maps, and as word spread, people gathered at a distance, whispering, watching, trying to read expressions for clues, and the HOA president finally appeared then, standing stiffly near her SUV, phone pressed to her ear, her earlier confidence replaced by something tighter, more brittle, because this wasn't her stage anymore, and over the next few hours the shoreline transformed into a grid of data points, each one quietly confirming what I already knew, that the authority exercised here for years rested on an outdated reference that should have been retired long ago, and by the end of the day the surveyors packed up without ceremony, leaving behind flags and silence, and that night, for the first time since the demolition, I slept without replaying the sound of breaking glass in my head, not because I felt safe, but because I knew the narrative was about to change. When systems realize their own exposure, they don't double down on enforcement, they start looking inward. And that inward look is rarely gentle, and sure enough, within a week, notices began appearing in mailboxes up and down the lake. Not fines this time, but requests for documentation, compliance confirmations, verification of approvals that many homeowners hadn't thought about in years, and panic spread quietly, because questions invite answers, and answers have a way of connecting dots people didn't know existed. And somewhere in all of that, the HOA board called an emergency meeting, closed door, no agenda posted, which told everyone exactly how serious this had become, because transparency disappears first when control starts slipping. And I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't need to be, I already knew what. They were discussing how to frame the demolition as an isolated incident, how to shift responsibility onto contractors or clerical errors, how to argue good faith, and how to avoid the one outcome they feared most, an official determination that their enforcement authority along the lake had never legally existed in the first place, because that wouldn't just undo what they'd done to me, it would unravel years of decisions. And as the week went on, I received another call, this one from a different office entirely, asking me to come in for an interview, not to resolve anything yet, just to establish a timeline. And the tone was different this time, careful, methodical, the voice of someone who had already read the file and knew it was bad. And when I hung up, I stood by the water for a long time, watching the flags flutter in the wind, thinking about how a small fine had turned into something no one could control anymore, and how the people who had believed that authority was automatic, unquestionable, were about to learn the hard way that power only exists where the paperwork supports it, and everything else is just noise waiting to collapse. The interview wasn't held in a courtroom or an office with flags and seals the way people imagine serious things happen. It was a plain conference room with a scratch table, bad coffee, and a digital recorder placed between us like a quiet witness. And the man asking the questions didn't raise his voice or challenge my answers. He just listened, nodding occasionally, letting pauses stretch until they became uncomfortable enough to invite honesty. And that's where the real damage always happens, in the space where people talk more than they should, because once you start laying out timelines, who sent what notice, who approved which action, who relied on which reference, you stop telling a story and start building a map, and maps reveal intersections no one planned for. And as I walked him through everything from the first crooked notice on my door to the sound of the excavator tearing through my home, I could see him making small notes whenever the same names came up again and again, because patterns matter more than single mistakes, and this wasn't one bad decision, it was a chain of them, reinforced by years of unchecked habit. And when he finally turned off the recorder, he didn't promise anything, didn't apologize, didn't even comment on the demolition itself. He just said, "We're going to need to widen the scope," which was bureaucratic language for "this is bigger than we thought." And within days that widening became visible, not to me but to everyone else. Audit requests went out, access credentials were temporarily suspended, enforcement actions were paused pending verification, and the phrase "out of an abundance of caution" began appearing in official emails, which is what institutions say when they're trying to slow the bleeding without admitting there's a wound. And the HOA board responded the only way boards do when control slips, by meeting more frequently and sharing less information. Doors closed, minutes delayed, agendas sanitized, and rumors filled the gaps. Some people said the county was overreaching, others said this was all my fault for not just paying the fine and moving on, and a few, the ones who had been fined repeatedly over the years, started asking questions they'd never dared to ask before, quietly comparing notices, parcel numbers, dates, realizing with a creeping sense of dread that their experiences weren't isolated at all. They were echoes of the same flawed authority, and that's when the HOA president made her biggest mistake, not the demolition, not the fines, but the attempt to regain narrative control. She sent out a community-wide email framing the situation as a temporary administrative review, triggered by external interference, emphasizing unity, compliance, and patience, urging residents not to engage with speculative claims. And for the first time since this began, she put her name in writing on a document that referenced jurisdiction, which might sound insignificant, but signatures matter when investigations are underway because they tie intent to action, and that email didn't calm anyone, it did the opposite. It confirmed fear, because people don't warn you against speculation unless there's something worth speculating about. And over the next week, attendance at board meetings doubled, then tripled, not because people supported her, but because they wanted answers, real ones, and she couldn't give them without exposing herself further, so she deflected, blamed contractors, blamed outdated maps, blamed former board members who no longer lived there, anything to avoid the one truth that mattered, that authority exercised without jurisdiction isn't just invalid, it's abusive. And while the neighborhood churned internally, the county moved forward methodically, requests turned into demands, reviews turned into findings, and one afternoon I received a copy of a preliminary determination, not marked final, not ready for release, but enough to confirm what I already suspected. The Shoreline Enforcement Authority cited by the HOA had lapsed decades earlier, any actions taken under it were subject to challenge, and demolition carried out under that authority constituted an unlawful act, regardless of intent. And I sat with that document for a long time, not feeling triumph, not feeling relief, just a heavy awareness of what it meant, because unlawful acts demand remedies, and remedies have consequences, not just for the people who ordered them, but for the systems that allowed them to continue, and those consequences began to surface quickly. Insurance carriers asked questions, contractors froze accounts, legal counsel appeared at board meetings where none had been before, and the HOA president, once so confident, now rarely spoke at all, sitting stiffly while attorneys whispered in her ear, because the story was no longer hers to tell, it belonged to records, to statutes, to findings that would be written whether she liked them or not. And the neighbors felt it too, that shift from outrage to fear, because when authority collapses, it doesn't just take villains with it, it exposes everyone who benefited from not looking too closely. And late one evening, as I stood by the lake watching the survey flags reflect in the water, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize, a single sentence asking if I'd be willing to discuss resolution options. And I knew then that the endgame had begun, not the public one. Not yet, but the private scrambling that happens right before systems are forced to choose between accountability and self-preservation, and no matter which one they chose, the outcome was no longer something they could control. After that message, I knew the quiet phase of the storm had begun, the kind you can't see from the street, but feel in every glance, every whisper, every door left slightly ajar, and the first move came from the contractors who had demolished the edge of my property. They began sending formal notices of liability, invoices that no one would approve, and subtle warnings about insurance coverage, and suddenly, the HOA found themselves trapped in a web they had thought was under their control. Scrambling to respond, sending vague emails to residents claiming miscommunications and clerical errors, while privately debating whether to challenge every demand or settle quietly before more documents surfaced. And in the background, neighbors started comparing notes, filing FOIA requests, snapping pictures of boundaries, and quietly recording meetings on their phones, as if instinctively sensing that the small cracks in authority could widen into fissures that no one could patch. And that was when the first law firm appeared, a sleek office with tinted windows and a nameplate that made my heart skip. Not because I feared them, but because they represented exactly the type of power that could either protect or destroy, depending on which side they chose, and they requested a meeting, not with the president, not with the board, but with me directly, asking if I would be open to discussing mutually beneficial resolutions, which sounded harmless on the surface, but I knew it meant leverage that had been missing for months, leverage that now belonged to me, even if I didn't yet fully understand how to wield it. And as I walked into that conference room, the same sterile carpet, the same faint smell of coffee and recycled air, I realized the game had shifted entirely. No more unilateral decisions, no more hidden fines, no more quiet threats left unchallenged, because the people who had once shrugged off the HOA's power were now awake, and every misstep, every signature, every outdated map, and every questionable claim was now a weapon in someone else's hand. And as the attorney laid out the preliminary framework for negotiation, citing statutory violations, lapses in jurisdiction, and potential financial exposure, I listened, nodding silently, aware that each sentence strengthened my position. And outside, the neighborhood seemed oblivious, cars passing, children playing, unaware that the structure they relied on for rules and guidance was crumbling from the inside, because authority is an illusion until it is enforced, and enforcement without legitimacy is just chaos disguised as order, and I had been standing in the middle of that chaos for months, documenting, observing, and surviving, and now, with lawyers, contractors, and auditors all moving like pieces across a chessboard, the HOA realized, too late, that the rules were no longer theirs to define. That control had shifted quietly, irrevocably, and the message I received the night before, the first acknowledgement that someone outside the neighborhood was paying attention, was a signal that the tides were rising, that the consequences of their arrogance, their blindness, and their habit of ignoring legal boundaries were about to wash over them in ways that would be documented, broadcast, and remembered. And even now, as I reviewed the drafts of agreements, the letters, and the maps marking where actions had been overstepped, I felt that peculiar mix of exhaustion and anticipation that comes when victory is close but not yet final, because winning isn't a single moment, it's the sum of months of persistence, patience, and awareness, and the story, still unfolding, demanded attention, strategy, and precision. And while I had started this conflict with a simple desire to reclaim what was mine, I realized it had grown into something far larger, something systemic, something that might change how power operated in that neighborhood forever. And in the silence that followed every phone call, every email, every meeting, there was a sense of inevitability, a quiet that was louder than any shouting, because it meant that the board, the president, the contractors, and even some residents could no longer pretend that the rules belonged to them. And in that quiet, I prepared for the next steps, aware that the game had only just begun. The days that followed blurred together like a fever dream, every morning bringing a new layer of complications, every evening revealing consequences I hadn't anticipated. And yet, despite the chaos, there was a strange rhythm, a pulse of inevitability that guided each step, because the neighborhood had shifted under my feet. People whispered in doorways, cars slowed as if expecting something to happen, and the once placid board meetings now felt like arenas, with glares that burned through the thin veneer of civility. And as I reviewed the latest set of documents from the attorney, my mind cataloged every misstep, every past fine that had been levied illegally, every boundary encroachment, every unapproved construction. And I realized I had more than leverage. I had ammunition, history, proof, and a growing network of allies who had been quietly gathering evidence themselves, footage, receipts, testimonies, each one a thread that, when woven together, created a tapestry of undeniable control. And yet the HOA was scrambling, sending increasingly desperate notices, calling emergency meetings, threatening lawsuits, hiring consultants to assess the situation. And each action only confirmed what I had suspected all along. Their power was performative, and authority without substance collapses under scrutiny, collapses under the weight of documentation and strategy, collapses under the patient persistence of someone who refuses to be intimidated. And the first major turning point came when I discovered a chain of emails revealing that the president had knowingly approved construction on land that was marked in official county records as privately owned, and not just mine. Other homeowners' boundaries had been quietly altered, misrepresented, and, in some cases, completely ignored. And suddenly this was no longer a personal vendetta. It was a systemic failure, a scandal waiting to be uncovered, and I realized the only way to win was to expose every layer, to document everything, to orchestrate each reveal with precision, because if handled recklessly, even victory could be tarnished. And the attorney suggested a phased approach. First the notices, then the documentation, then public exposure if necessary, and I agreed, aware that timing was as important as the facts, because an enemy who knows they are being watched behaves differently. And in this case, the HOA had become a cornered animal, their threats hollow, their meetings performative, their internal debates frantic, and every resident I spoke with quietly confirmed suspicions that had been dismissed for months. The fines, the restrictions, the sudden inspections, they had all been arbitrary, biased, and in some cases unlawful, and the realization that the neighborhood itself had been a silent witness to these abuses only fueled my resolve, because once the truth was revealed, no one could unsee it, no one could justify it, and every action moving forward would be framed not as retaliation, but as rightful reclamation, as the restoration of order, fairness, and property rights. And as the first formal notices went out, carefully worded, legally sound, and impossible to ignore, I watched the board scramble, the president's face pale in every meeting, their emails growing defensive, their consultants increasingly cautious, and the contractors who had once acted without hesitation began second-guessing their involvement, while neighbors started subtly siding with me, documenting their own grievances, preparing statements, and the tension that had been simmering for years finally reached a boil, because now it was not a question of if the HOA would respond, it was how, and how badly. And as I reviewed each new piece of evidence, cross-referenced maps, assessed legal angles, and planned public disclosure, I realized that the stakes had grown beyond my own land, beyond my own property, beyond any individual grievance. The neighborhood itself would never be the same. The illusion of control the HOA had maintained was gone, replaced by a collective awareness that power is meaningless without legitimacy, that every threat can be dismantled if carefully studied, and every action can be reversed if timed correctly. And in the quiet moments between calls and letters, I allowed myself a rare thought, that this was not just a fight to reclaim property, but a battle to redefine the rules, to prove that patience, persistence, and strategy outweigh arrogance, shortcuts, and unchecked authority. And even as the storm of meetings, notices, inspections, and legal maneuvers raged, I felt a strange calm, a certainty that every step I had taken, every record I had preserved, every minor victory I had accrued, was leading toward an outcome that was inevitable, irreversible, and most importantly, just because in the end, those who thought they ruled through fear and paperwork were about to learn that there is a different kind of power, one built on preparation, observation, and the relentless pursuit of what is rightfully yours. And as the first wave of reactions rolled in, angry calls, urgent emails, whispers through neighbors, and the sudden appearance of higher authorities reviewing the documentation, I knew this story, my story, was far from over. But for the first time, the narrative was no longer theirs to control. The aftermath of the notices was immediate, chaotic, and far-reaching, because the HOA had underestimated the sheer weight of evidence I had amassed, and now every meeting, every phone call, every attempt to intimidate me collided with the reality that I was no longer just a single homeowner. I had become a symbol, a force that neighbors quietly rallied behind. And the first confrontation came when the president stormed into a scheduled meeting, documents clutched in trembling hands, trying to assert authority as if volume could mask the truth, only to be met with silent stares and pointed references to county records, emails, and property deeds that left them floundering, their usual allies exchanging awkward glances, unsure where to place loyalty. And the tension in the room was electric, palpable, as if the walls themselves had absorbed years of petty grievances, fines, and hidden agendas, and now released them in a storm that left no space for pretense. While outside, neighbors whispered and gathered, watching the board building with cautious curiosity, their phones recording, their eyes sharp, every minor slip captured. And I realized that this wasn't just a legal battle. It had become a psychological one, where perception mattered as much as legality, and every glance, every word, every hesitant pause became a weapon. And as the president attempted to push back, citing bylaws that had been selectively enforced, I countered with evidence of inconsistent application, documented exceptions, and testimonies from contractors who had been pressured into ignoring rules, and each revelation chipped away at the foundation of their authority, forcing them into defensive stances, retractions, and eventually panic. While in the background, a subtle network of allies had begun recording meetings, collecting data, and preparing for the moment when public exposure would be necessary, because if the board thought they could intimidate, they had miscalculated entirely. And the first public twist came when a group of residents requested an emergency session to review all violations, fines, and construction approvals, and the president's attempts to suppress it failed spectacularly, with more evidence surfacing of unauthorized constructions, misrepresented property lines, and approvals signed under questionable circumstances. While I quietly watched each move, calculating timing, anticipating resistance, and preparing the next wave, knowing that the chaos was actually strategic, that the more they reacted emotionally, the weaker their position became. And then came the most unexpected blow. An anonymous tip to the county inspector revealing that several structures approved by the HOA violated not only internal bylaws but state regulations. And within hours, inspectors were on site, measurements taken, permits reviewed, and suddenly the president's carefully constructed world began to unravel in real time. Contractors panicked, board members argued publicly, residents whispered in disbelief, and every piece of evidence I had amassed seemed to gain exponential power as officials reviewed it, while a small, tense crowd outside watched cameras flash, phones record, and neighbors' eyes widen at the unfolding spectacle. And in the midst of this storm, I received an email from an old acquaintance, someone who had quietly observed the HOA's misdeeds for years, and who now offered corroborating documents that confirmed years of illegal fees, arbitrary fines, and boundary encroachments, expanding the scope of what was already a crushing legal exposure. And as I absorbed the contents, I realized that the narrative was about to shift dramatically. This was no longer just my fight, no longer just about reclaiming land or correcting wrongs. This had become a full-blown exposé, a reckoning, and the president, sensing the tide turning, resorted to desperate measures, calling in attorneys who attempted to threaten, intimidate, and delay, only to be met with preemptive counter-notices, legal citations, and documented proof that their threats were baseless. while every misstep was silently recorded, every misstatement logged, and the residents who had once felt powerless now quietly aligned, preparing statements, signing petitions, and readying themselves for the eventual public presentation. And the tension reached a fever pitch when a sudden revelation exposed that some board members had secretly profited from misrepresented property sales and approvals, creating a financial scandal that dwarfed the original disputes. And as news of this leaked, the president's composure cracked, meetings devolved into chaos, emails turned frantic, contractors abandoned projects mid-task, and the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its collective breath, because the story had grown beyond revenge, beyond property rights, beyond fines and bylaws. It had become a revelation of systemic corruption, of unchecked authority, of what happens when power is misused. And as inspectors, residents, and legal advisors converged on the scene, I felt a strange satisfaction, a calm certainty, that every calculated step, every documented detail, every patient maneuver had led to this tipping point, because in that moment, the HOA no longer controlled the narrative, no longer dictated the pace, no longer instilled fear. The rules had been rewritten, the balance of power restored, and as the first public reports circulated, neighbors quietly celebrated, authorities confirmed violations, and the president and board scrambled to contain the fallout, I knew this story, my story, had reached a point where victory was not just possible, it was inevitable. And yet, even as the chaos unfolded, I realized that the real work had only begun. Restoring fairness, rebuilding trust, and ensuring that the neighborhood would never again be subjected to the unchecked whims of an overreaching HOA. And with every passing hour, every new revelation, every minor victory stacking upon the previous, the sense of inevitability grew, because this time, the story was no longer theirs to control. It belonged to the truth.